Bruno had been wandering the wilderness for days. His body, once hardened and strong from countless brutal fights, was now weakening under the relentless pangs of hunger. His muscles, which had once thrived on aggression and power, were now fatigued. Yet, despite the hunger gnawing at him, Bruno pressed on, driven by one primal instinct: survival. For the past few days, his mind had been consumed by the thought of food. He had searched relentlessly, his sharp instincts guiding him through the dense forest. But each step grew harder. His paws, worn from the rough terrain, were becoming sore. The taste of food seemed more like a distant memory with each passing hour. Then, just as he thought his energy would fail him, something caught his attention. It was a faint, strange scent that tickled his nostrils, a scent unlike anything he had encountered before. It was not the smell of prey, the usual scent he'd been trained to hunt. This was something different, something unfamiliar. His stomach growled in response, but not with hunger. It was something deeper, something primal. Bruno instinctively lowered his head and prowled forward. He was a hunter, after all, and his body responded with lightning speed. The smell grew stronger, and soon he could hear it, a faint, fragile sound, a soft cry that barely reached his ears. His sharp senses honed in on it, and with every step, the sound grew clearer, the scent stronger. His pace quickened. There was something alive, something vulnerable, just ahead. Pushing through the tall grass, he saw it. A tiny human, a baby, wrapped in frayed blankets. The sight of the small, helpless creature stopped Bruno in his tracks. His sharp instincts, honed over years of survival in the wild, told him to turn away, to leave the creature alone. It was not prey. It was not food. But something inside Bruno resisted that instinct, something unfamiliar stirred within him. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to attack. He didn't feel the usual bloodlust or hunger. Instead, a feeling of protectiveness, something Bruno didn't fully understand, began to wash over him. It was stronger than his need to eat. Stronger than anything he had ever felt before. Frozen in place, Bruno studied the baby. The small body, fragile and exposed, whimpered weakly. It tugged at something deep inside him, and without thinking, he stepped closer. His massive frame towered over the baby as he lowered his head, bringing his nose close to the infant. A soft whine escaped his throat. Confusion flooded him. He didn't know what to do. He had never felt this way. It was a new feeling, something he couldn't explain. Bruno's instincts, once solely driven by hunger, shifted. The hunger still gnawed at him, but something far more powerful began to take over. This was not prey. This was something to protect. Without fully understanding why, Bruno lay down beside the baby, curling his large, muscular body around it like a shield. His instincts, so often at odds with compassion, had found a new purpose. He was no longer just a fierce fighting dog, he was now a protector. The night began to fall, and as the darkness crept in, Bruno's body shivered with exhaustion. The air grew cold, and the baby, still weak and fragile, shivered against Bruno's warm fur. Instinctively, he nudged the baby with his nose, offering whatever warmth he could. The baby's breathing was shallow, its cries soft and fading. Bruno knew that the child needed more than warmth. It needed care. It needed shelter. His stomach rumbled, reminding him of the hunger that still gnawed at him. But Bruno knew there was something more pressing now. The baby was vulnerable, and he had a duty to protect it. His sharp instincts told him they needed shelter, a place where both he and the baby could rest safely. Bruno's protective instincts were growing stronger, and he began to rise, looking around for any sign of a safe place. Through the darkness, he saw a flicker of hope. There, in the distance, was a small creek, its faint scent of water pulling Bruno forward. His muscles, sore from exhaustion, screamed in protest, but he moved forward, step by step. Each stride brought him closer to safety. When Bruno reached the creek, he gently set the baby down, positioning it near the water's edge. He drank deeply, quenching his own thirst before nudging the baby's blanket closer to the water, hoping to give the child a chance to drink, to feel life again. It was a small gesture, but Bruno hoped it would revive the baby, giving it the strength it needed to survive. For a brief moment, the baby stirred. The faintest movement toward the water's edge. Bruno watched intently, his heart swelling with a fierce protective pride. This tiny, fragile creature had become his responsibility. The hunger in his stomach was still there, but it no longer mattered. He had a new mission now, to keep the baby safe. As the night grew darker, Bruno's sharp instincts kicked in again. The baby needed a safe place to rest, somewhere sheltered from the cold and any possible threats. Bruno's senses, ever alert, guided him deeper into the forest. The terrain was rough, but Bruno pressed on, his body trembling from the exhaustion. He was growing weaker, but the baby's well-being kept him moving forward. Finally, after what felt like hours, Bruno spotted a small cluster of rocks, forming a natural shelter. The overhang would provide protection from the wind, and the rocks would shield them from the elements. Bruno, despite the weight of his own exhaustion, carefully placed the baby in the small shelter, curling his body around it to protect it from the cold. As he lay there, his muscles sore and his body yearning for rest, Bruno knew that his journey was far from over. But for now, they were safe. As Bruno lay beside the baby, his mind raced with the changes unfolding within him. He had once been a fierce fighting dog, abandoned and lost, but now he had found something worth protecting. The baby had become his mission, and the deep, primal urge to shield it filled him with purpose. The hunger, the pain, the exhaustion, they could all wait. For now, the only thing that mattered was the fragile life beside him, the one he had sworn to protect at all costs. The night passed slowly, the hours stretching on as Bruno lay awake, ever vigilant. His body trembled from the cold, but he refused to sleep deeply, knowing the baby depended on him. And as dawn began to break, Bruno's protective instincts flared once again. The baby was still breathing, its tiny chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. Bruno nudged it gently, offering whatever warmth he could as he prepared for the next phase of their journey. For now, Bruno was no longer just a dog. He was a protector. And he would not rest until the baby was safe. As the first light of dawn broke through the thick canopy of trees, Bruno's body ached with the weight of the night. His muscles were stiff from the cold ground and the long hours spent keeping watch over the baby. Despite the exhaustion that pulled at his bones, he remained alert. His senses, sharp as ever, scanned the surroundings for any signs of danger. The forest, though quiet for now, felt alive with unseen threats. Bruno could hear the distant rustle of leaves, the faint chirping of birds waking for the day, but his focus never wavered. The baby's tiny, fragile form was the only thing that mattered. Bruno shifted his large body closer to the baby, curling his frame around it to share what little warmth he could. The baby, still weak, let out a soft whimper but remained otherwise still, its small breaths shallow but steady. Bruno nudged it with his nose, reassuring himself that the child was still alive. His protective instincts were in full force now, driving him to stay by its side, to guard it from any harm. The hunger in Bruno's stomach gnawed at him, but it was a distant, almost irrelevant feeling now. He had survived through far worse conditions, brutal fights, days without food, the loneliness of being abandoned. But this was different. His heart, once hardened by the cruelty of his past, had softened in the presence of this helpless child. It was as if the baby had awakened a part of Bruno that he had long forgotten, a part capable of love, of loyalty, of sacrifice. As the morning sun slowly crept higher into the sky, Bruno knew they couldn't stay in the open any longer. The shelter of the rock overhang, while offering some protection, was temporary. Bruno needed to find a safer place for the baby, a more secure location where they could rest without fear. His instincts told him they needed to keep moving, to find shelter deeper in the forest where they would be hidden from predators and the elements. Bruno gently picked up the baby's blanket in his mouth, lifting it with careful precision. He knew the child needed to be moved, but he also understood that the journey ahead would be difficult. The baby, weak and malnourished, needed rest, and Bruno's body, exhausted from days without food, was not in any better shape. Yet he pushed on, step by step, determined to find a safe haven. His legs wobbled beneath him as he moved forward, each step slow but deliberate. Bruno's powerful frame, once full of aggression, now seemed heavy with exhaustion, but his resolve remained unshaken. He was a protector now, and nothing would deter him from his mission. The forest around him began to change. The open stretches of land that had once seemed endless were giving way to denser foliage. The trees grew taller, their branches twisting together to create a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. Bruno's senses were on high alert. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig beneath his paws, was a potential threat. His sharp eyes scanned the surroundings constantly, while his ears swiveled at the slightest sound. As he moved deeper into the woods, Bruno's thirst became more pressing. His tongue, dry and rough, scraped against the roof of his mouth. His stomach, empty and aching, growled softly. The hunger was impossible to ignore, but Bruno knew that he couldn't afford to stop now. Not when the baby depended on him. Yet, in the back of his mind, the thought of finding water drove him forward. He needed to hydrate, to keep his strength up. The baby, too, needed water, and Bruno was determined to provide whatever it took. It wasn't long before the smell of water reached his nose. The faint scent of a nearby creek hung in the air, and Bruno's pace quickened as he moved toward it. His legs, trembling from exhaustion, carried him through the underbrush, each step bringing him closer to the life-giving stream. The water was not just a relief for his own parched throat, it was a lifeline for the baby. When Bruno finally reached the creek, he lowered his head to drink, lapping at the cool, refreshing water. He drank deeply, feeling the cold liquid soothe his dry throat and settle his aching body. For a moment, he allowed himself to savor the relief, but he knew the job wasn't done yet. The baby needed to drink too. Bruno gently nudged the baby's blanket closer to the water, using his nose to coax some of the liquid toward the child. He watched carefully, his amber eyes fixed on the baby's fragile form, as he hoped for a sign of life. The baby, though weak, stirred slightly. Its tiny hand reached out toward the moisture, instinctively trying to drink. Bruno watched, a flicker of hope rising in his chest. It was a small movement, but it was enough. The baby was still clinging to life. Despite the small victory, Bruno knew they couldn't stay by the creek for long. The area was exposed, and they needed shelter. The sun was rising higher now, casting long shadows across the forest floor, and Bruno's instincts warned him that they were vulnerable. With a final nudge to the baby's blanket, he carefully lifted the child once again, cradling it gently in his mouth. The journey was far from over. Bruno's legs, though still weary, moved with renewed purpose. His senses, heightened by the urgency of their situation, guided him through the dense forest. The trees grew closer together, their trunks thick and gnarled. The air around them grew damp, and Bruno could feel the chill creeping into his bones. He pressed on, step by step, his heart beating in time with the baby's fragile breaths. Eventually, Bruno came across a small clearing. In the distance, he saw something that could be their salvation, a dilapidated cabin, its roof sagging and its walls weathered by years of neglect. It wasn't much, but it offered the promise of shelter, a roof over their heads, and safety from the elements. Bruno approached cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of danger. The clearing was eerily quiet, save for the sound of a bird's call in the distance. His body tensed as he made his way toward the cabin. He could feel the weight of his exhaustion pulling at him, but he refused to stop. They were so close now. When Bruno reached the cabin, he gently placed the baby down on the ground. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, the creaking of the wood sending a shiver through his frame. The inside was dark and dusty, but it would have to do. It was a place to rest, a place to recover, and most importantly, a place to protect the baby. Bruno stepped inside, positioning himself between the baby and the door. His eyes remained vigilant, scanning every corner of the room. He could feel his body trembling from exhaustion, but he remained alert. His purpose now was clear. He had to protect this fragile life, no matter the cost. As Bruno settled down beside the baby, his instincts were still sharp. The hunger and exhaustion that had plagued him for so long were now distant memories. The baby had become his mission, his responsibility. The primal need to protect was stronger than anything else. Bruno closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself a brief respite. But even as he lay beside the baby, his mind never stopped working. There was still danger out there, still threats to contend with. But for now, he had succeeded. He had found shelter. He had kept the baby safe. And that was all that mattered. As the morning light crept through the cracks in the dilapidated cabin, Bruno lay beside the baby, still alert, his senses on high alert. The air was heavy with the silence of the wilderness, broken only by the distant call of birds and the rustle of the wind through the trees outside. Bruno's large body remained tense, his protective instincts still sharp as ever. The warmth of the baby's small form against him was comforting, but it wasn't enough to dull the gnawing hunger deep within his stomach. His body ached from exhaustion, his muscles sore and stiff, but his mind remained focused on one thing: keeping the baby safe. The cabin, though offering some protection from the elements, was far from ideal. The roof had seen better days, and the walls were crumbling from years of neglect. The floor was littered with debris, and the windows were cracked, allowing the wind to cut through the fragile shelter. But for now, it was enough. Bruno's keen senses told him they had found a temporary refuge. He could rest, but only for a short time. His instincts told him that they needed to keep moving. They couldn't stay in one place for too long. Bruno shifted his weight carefully, trying not to disturb the baby. The small form was still, its breathing shallow but steady. The baby had begun to regain some strength, but it was clear that it still needed time. Bruno, however, was growing weaker by the minute. His hunger, which he had pushed aside for so long, was now impossible to ignore. His stomach growled loudly, the sound echoing through the quiet cabin. Despite his best efforts to ignore it, Bruno knew that he couldn't continue on much longer without food. His muscles were trembling with fatigue, his body begging for rest. But the thought of the baby, of the tiny, helpless creature that had relied on him, kept him going. He had to push through the pain, had to ignore the hunger, for the baby's sake. Bruno's resolve was as strong as ever. He would protect this child with his life if necessary. The day passed slowly. Bruno didn't let his guard down for a moment, constantly scanning the surrounding area for any signs of danger. His eyes darted toward the broken windows, watching the shadows shift as the sunlight faded. Every crack and crevice in the cabin seemed to hold the potential for a threat. Bruno's ears perked up at every sound, his muscles tensing at the slightest movement outside. The baby shifted in its blanket, letting out a soft cry. Bruno immediately leaned down, his large, scarred face close to the child. He nuzzled the baby gently with his nose, trying to comfort it. The tiny form stirred again, its eyes fluttering open for the first time in hours. It was still weak, its tiny body barely able to move, but it was alive. Bruno's heart swelled with relief. The baby had survived the night, and that meant everything. The hunger in Bruno's belly was a constant reminder of the harsh reality of their situation. He couldn't ignore it much longer, but his instincts told him to wait. The baby still needed him, and Bruno couldn't risk leaving it alone, not when it was so vulnerable. His entire focus was on keeping the child safe. For the first time in his life, Bruno felt something deeper than the urge to hunt or fight. He felt loyalty, a bond stronger than anything he had ever known before. The air in the cabin grew colder as night fell once again. The sounds of the forest outside grew louder, the eerie howls of distant animals echoing through the trees. Bruno's protective instincts flared. He knew that they weren't safe yet. There were predators out there, dangerous creatures who would take advantage of their weakness if given the chance. Bruno had faced down larger threats before, but this was different. The baby was his responsibility now, and he would not let anything harm it. As the wind picked up, Bruno stood and paced the small cabin, his eyes never leaving the baby. He knew that they couldn't stay here forever. They needed to find a more permanent shelter, somewhere secure and safe from any predators. His ears pricked up at every noise, and his sharp eyes searched the surroundings, always alert. Finally, as the night wore on, Bruno's exhaustion became unbearable. He knew they needed to move, but he had reached the limit of his strength. His legs were weak, and every step felt like it took everything out of him. But he couldn't give up now. Not when the baby needed him. Bruno slowly turned and nudged the baby gently with his nose, trying to stir it from its slumber. The baby whimpered softly but didn't wake. Bruno's heart ached at the sight. The child was so small, so fragile. He had to find a way to protect it, to keep it safe from the dangers of the wilderness. With great effort, Bruno lifted the baby's blanket in his mouth once more. He carried the child carefully, each step a struggle as his muscles protested the movement. The pain in his stomach was unbearable, but Bruno ignored it. The baby's safety was all that mattered. His instincts drove him forward, step by step. The night was dark, and the air was heavy with a foreboding stillness. Bruno's senses were on high alert, every noise causing his muscles to tense. The world around him seemed to close in as he navigated the dense woods, the shadows of the trees looming over him. Bruno's heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced with fear. What if something happened to the baby? What if he couldn't protect it? He moved through the forest with a sense of urgency, his body trembling from exhaustion but still pushing forward. His eyes scanned the surroundings for any sign of danger. The faint rustle of leaves caught his attention, and Bruno's muscles tensed, ready to spring into action. But as the sound grew closer, he realized it was just the wind, nothing to worry about. Bruno's legs ached, and his breath came in ragged gasps. His hunger was unbearable now, and he could feel his body beginning to fail him. But still, he pushed on. The baby was depending on him. Bruno couldn't stop now. The trees around him thickened, and the path grew narrower. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. Bruno's sharp eyes caught sight of a small, overgrown path winding through the trees. It looked like it led deeper into the forest, toward a more sheltered area. Bruno's instincts told him this was the way to go. He picked up his pace, the promise of safety driving him forward. The path grew steeper, and Bruno's steps slowed, his legs shaking with the effort. But he kept going. He couldn't stop now. Not when the baby was so close to safety. As Bruno reached the end of the path, he saw a glimmer of hope. In the distance, there was a small cluster of rocks, forming a natural overhang, a cave, perhaps. It looked like a safe place, somewhere they could rest and recover. Bruno's heart swelled with relief. They had made it. The baby was going to be safe. But just as Bruno moved toward the shelter, he heard something that froze him in his tracks. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. And not just any footsteps, these were the heavy, deliberate steps of predators. His body went rigid, and his eyes darted toward the sound. Bruno's protective instincts flared as he stood between the baby and the incoming threat. He knew he had to fight. No matter what, he would protect the baby. The wolves were closing in, their eyes gleaming with hunger. Bruno's heart raced as he prepared for the worst. They were not safe yet. The tension in the air thickened as Bruno heard the unmistakable sound of predators closing in. His ears flattened against his head, and his powerful muscles tensed, ready for whatever was to come. The baby, still wrapped in its blanket, was nestled in the crook of his body, vulnerable and fragile. Bruno's amber eyes flicked to the shadows around him, the forest seemingly closing in as the distant howls grew louder. The wolves, or whatever predators stalked them in the night, were drawing near. Bruno's instincts surged, and he immediately lowered his body, positioning himself between the baby and the approaching danger. His fierce protective drive had fully taken over, pushing aside all thoughts of exhaustion, hunger, and pain. His body ached from the battles of the past days, his muscles strained from carrying the baby, but he was resolute. He would not back down. This was his responsibility now. The baby was his to protect, and no predator would take that from him. The first of the predators emerged from the underbrush, a sleek, dark figure with glowing yellow eyes. Bruno's eyes locked onto the animal, recognizing it as a coyote, its body low to the ground, its movements deliberate and cautious. It was watching him closely, its eyes fixed on Bruno and the baby. The coyote's snarl was soft, almost a warning, as if it knew the fierce dog it faced was not an easy prey. Bruno's growl rumbled deep from his chest, his teeth bared, his stance firm and unyielding. A second coyote emerged, followed quickly by a third. Bruno's heart pounded in his chest, but his focus remained sharp. His mind worked quickly, calculating his options. He was outnumbered, weak from days without food, and yet he stood his ground. The baby behind him remained still, and Bruno's sharp hearing could hear the baby's tiny, shallow breaths. It was still so fragile. He could not afford to let it come to harm now. The coyotes circled slowly, their movements deliberate, but Bruno did not back down. Every part of him, from his trembling legs to the deep, primal instincts inside him, was alert and prepared. The lead coyote, a particularly large one, took a step closer, its sharp teeth bared in a challenge. Bruno responded with a deep, guttural growl, a warning, but the coyote pressed forward, undeterred. In an instant, the coyote lunged, aiming for Bruno's throat. With lightning reflexes, Bruno snapped his jaws shut, catching the coyote by the shoulder, the force of his bite sending the predator yelping back into the underbrush. But as soon as Bruno released the first coyote, the second one lunged from the left, trying to seize Bruno's hind leg. With a quick twist of his body, Bruno managed to strike out, his jaws connecting with the coyote's side, pushing it away. The third coyote, seeing the opportunity, darted forward, sinking its teeth into Bruno's shoulder. The pain was immediate, sharp, but Bruno's resolve didn't falter. He shook his body violently, trying to dislodge the animal, ignoring the pain that shot through his shoulder as the coyote's teeth dug deeper. With a growl of frustration, Bruno managed to land a blow with his powerful paws, sending the third coyote retreating. Despite the pain, Bruno stood firm. He had taken on countless battles before, but this was different. The baby's life was in his paws. He couldn't lose now. The coyotes hesitated for a moment, their eyes wary of the injured but fierce dog that stood between them and the baby. Bruno's stance remained strong, his growl unwavering. The lead coyote took a step back, eyeing Bruno carefully. The tension in the air was palpable. The fight had gone in Bruno's favor, but the coyotes knew they had the advantage of numbers. However, as Bruno's unwavering gaze locked with the lead coyote's, something shifted. A low, menacing growl reverberated from the deep of Bruno's chest, a sound that conveyed more than just a physical threat. It was a promise: he would not back down, not even if it cost him everything. For what felt like an eternity, the coyotes circled him, each waiting for a moment of weakness. But Bruno showed none. His protective instincts flared even brighter, fueled by the need to shield the baby at all costs. Finally, the lead coyote backed away, its yellow eyes still locked on Bruno. One by one, the other coyotes followed suit, retreating into the shadows. Bruno's gaze followed them, never relaxing until he was sure they were gone. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, his muscles trembling from the effort of the battle. He had won, for now. The baby was safe. As the predators melted into the woods, Bruno stayed on alert for a moment longer, his body still poised to fight. But when the danger had passed, his body sagged in exhaustion. His energy, his strength, had been drained by the fight, and he could feel the weight of his injuries, the sharp pain in his shoulder and the deep ache in his limbs. But even with the pain, Bruno's heart swelled with pride. He had protected the baby. That was all that mattered. Turning slowly, Bruno returned to the small shelter of the rocks, where the baby lay, still bundled in its blanket. It had not moved during the fight, and Bruno's heart tightened with concern. He nudged the baby gently with his nose, his heart pounding with worry. Had the fight frightened it? Was it okay? The baby stirred slightly, its small hand reaching out to grasp at Bruno's fur. Bruno's heart swelled with a rush of warmth. The baby was still alive, still clinging to life, and that meant everything. Bruno carefully curled his large body around the child once again, his protective instincts returning to the forefront. The battle had been hard, but they had made it through. Bruno had won this fight. As the night wore on and the quiet of the forest returned, Bruno allowed himself a brief moment of rest. His eyes remained open, always on the lookout, always alert. The fight had taken a toll, but he would not rest for long. He had a duty to the baby, and that duty was far from over. The journey was far from over. There were more obstacles ahead, more dangers to face. But as Bruno lay beside the baby, the child's tiny form pressed against him for warmth, he knew one thing with certainty: he would protect this baby for as long as it took. Nothing would stand in his way. This was his purpose now. The night seemed quieter now, the danger gone, for now. Bruno's exhaustion was all-consuming, but he remained vigilant. The world was still full of threats, but he had become something more than just a fighting dog. He had become a protector, a guardian. And nothing, not hunger, nor pain, nor the world itself, would stop him from fulfilling that purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But for now, Bruno allowed himself to close his eyes for just a moment. His mission had been accomplished. The baby was safe. And that was all that mattered.